All right, we're back for another conversation. And last time we talked about areas that philosophy deals with, the questions that philosophy is asking, questions about um, ontology and cosmology, epistemology. What we want to do beginning today is start talking about the philosophical roots of a lot of the problems we've been discussing. So we've been sort of just observing the landscape. What are the problems that we see? And now we want to go back and say, okay, where did these problems find their philosophical roots, their foundations, and how are we still sort of subscribing to those philosophies that are causing these problems today before we'll finally get to, all right, what are the solutions? How do we push back? And so today we're going to start talking about modernism and what it is to be a modernist, and what are the foundational, the philosophical roots of that, and how that still has tentacles in the way we think today. And so, Kayla, why don't you introduce the topic there a little bit for us?
Sure. As Stephen and I have both mentioned in many of our lessons on analyzing postmodernism, most people recognize postmodernism. It's kind of the popular boogeyman today, especially among Christian circles, to talk about how bad postmodernism is. And most people relate that to some form of relativism or unhinged denial of reality. But what most people don't realize is postmodernism actually has to be understood in light of modernism. And because it is post, that's the prefix, it comes after modernism. And many ways, and Steve and I and other conversations Steve and I have kind of discussed this. Are we still in modernism as a society? And in many ways we are, but people don't think about that. Many Christians don't think about what is modernism, or they don't recognize that may be the system they are living under, even though postmodernism is thrown out a lot, and they may think they live under a postmodern system. Really, we're living under modernism, or what's called modernity. And real quick, like for me, modernism has to do with a humanist framework, which means humans are the measure of all things. It's our perceptions, our recognitions, our ingenuity that is so great. And it provides broad scale narratives of what humans should or shouldn't do. And it focuses on technological advancement, on enlightenment, on industrialization. Many of these things are downstream of the broader principle of modernism. And hopefully we'll have opportunities in other conversations to discuss the historical development, because all of this in terms of modernism comes from changes and movements, not only in thought, but also in political and social and economic realities that change the way that we think. But we've inherited this form and system of thought. So sometimes this broad, really complex system of philosophies that work together to provide what oftentimes is the Western perspective can be described as modernist or modernity. That's kind of the root of it. And the illustration that I oftentimes give in terms of, well, if you think about an extreme of modernism, what is it? To me, it's Star Trek. Star Trek is all about modernity. We're going to expand. We're going to search for science. We're going to search for truth through science. And the material reality is the ultimate reality, and humans are the main focus and ultimately the protagonist of all the universe. And that is very much in my kind of shorthand view what modernity is. That kind of view of Star Trek, and I think most people can kind of get that. What do you think about modernity, modernism? How would you define it, Stephen?
Yeah, so obviously, the more we get into this, there's a lot of complexity, and we want to be careful. Like what we're saying about what we're going to say about modernism is not some unified theory. There are contributors to this, and they diverge, right? There are different directions that modernism goes, and all of us aren't operating under all the assumptions of modernism, but I do think that we're affected by it. To Caleb's point, with Star Trek being a great representation, one of the I think overriding concepts in modernism is that we are always getting better, and that each iteration, each era of man is an improvement on the last era. And just like I mean, just to go ahead and point out some ways that assumption comes through when people talk about, for instance, the Old Testament. It can become very easy to talk about it like the people had primitive brains, that had not come to the intellectual capacity that we have today, which is nonsense. That from a biblical perspective, God created man. I think we talked about this in our last episode, that Adam was a fully capable human being, and probably a more capable in many ways human being, because he lived before the fall. And so the notion that we're getting better and better ideas all the time is part of modernism. And this is not to say that nobody ever comes up with better ideas than previous generations, but it certainly should not be assumed that every generation is coming up with better ideas. And the notion of progress, that we're always progressing. One of the things that'll happen when people are discussing a moral question is they'll say, somebody might say, used to, we did this and we believe this. And then somebody will say, yeah, well, they also used to not take baths, or something like that.
Right.
And so you just lump it all together, right? So here, this ancient people, because they did something differently than we do, and we view that as a primitive thing that they did, then everything, their whole thought process is primitive, and therefore not as refined and thoughtful as our thought processes. That's all of that's rooted in modernism and modernist thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the myth of progress is something that people we're just raised in, and it affects so much. We think about scientific progress, think about cultural progress, or economic progress. There's always this kind of assumption, well, we're going to be better in the future. And where does that come from? It doesn't come from nothing, and it comes from this system of modernism. Because really, the modernist system, kind of starting to look at the historical frame of it, you have the time period of the Middle Ages, and we even today call the time period of the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, which is probably not an accurate description. I'm not going to go into all of that, but the coming out of the times of the Middle Ages, you had various economic, political, technological advancements that opened up times for the Renaissance. Also, toward the end of the Middle Ages, beginning of the Renaissance time period, you have the huge shift of the Reformation, and the change of the gridlock of the Catholic Church and the dominance of the Catholic Church, opening up to various Protestant movements in Europe, Central and Western Europe. And so you've got all this change going on. You've got these advancements. Philosophy is starting to change as well. And as people leave the kind of more the older system of the Middle Ages, they're looking for new ways to interact, not just with each other, with religion, with economic systems, but also philosophy was a huge monumental change that took place. And kind of the father of most what would be described modern philosophy, and I use that term a little more broadly than just modernism, is seen with René Descartes. And Descartes was a monumental thinker and was just absolutely brilliant. A lot of people today, sadly, will read Descartes with a very critical lens or a condescending lens, kind of as Stephen was noting, thinking, oh, well, we know better than Descartes right now. But his attempts for creating a system that could be kind of agreed upon by all people, regardless of their religious perspective, was, when I say religious perspective, I mean more like Protestant versus Catholic, not all various religions. He made really great strides in kind of bringing a foundation for what modern philosophy would be. Because prior to that, everyone believed God, the theologians, the Catholic Church, or whatever church they were part of, was kind of like the foundation of all things. And Descartes was moving beyond that. And his break away from the more ancient systems of a nestled philosophy within religious grounding is considered to be the dawn of the modern era in regards to philosophy. And most books today that you will read in terms of discussing philosophic thought will start with Descartes as kind of the beginning of that. Obviously, Descartes had his rule, and as brother Stephen said before, you can keep pulling that string, and you can go from Descartes back to Aquinas and Anselm and Occam and all the way back. Obviously, he didn't just appear out of nothing, but for most purposes, we can kind of start with Descartes as a start point. Now, what do you think on the starting point and the historical context of modernism, Stephen?
Yeah, so I think if you go read a book, look up modernism, it's going to start at Descartes, most likely. For a deeper discussion, we could maybe recommend things down the line to get into where do these philosophies come from, where are they built on. But one thing I think is important to understand is the effect of history on that, right? These philosophies are not coming up out of thin air, but they are answers to what's going on in the world around. And what's going on in the world around is a fracturing of the old order. And with the especially with the Reformation, there was kind of a stranglehold by the Catholic Church on the notion of truth. On that's where philosophy was done, right? And over the oversight of that. And so you have a breaking of that, and then there's this assumption by the reformers that if we approach the Bible this way, that we'll all end up agreeing. And then that didn't happen. And it not only didn't happen, but it violently didn't happen, right? Mm-hmm. And so now, if we can't just all sit down and read the Bible and come to same conclusions, then how are we supposed to live together and agree on things? What is the standard? And so people begin to start thinking of what standards can we appeal to other than the Bible that will allow us to function as a society. Because basically you had the church, the Catholic Church, as that other thing, right? They are the final arbiters. Well, now you've kind of crashed the authority of that. And then now we thought the Bible was going to be the authority for all of us, but then we can't agree on what that's saying. And so then now, is there some other standard? And so that's the question, I think, that really gets this ball rolling. And a lot of bad answers are given in response to that. But I think it's a legitimate question, right? And what happens in a society where we all agree that the Bible is the Word of God, which is not the society we're living in. But let's say you live in a society where everybody believes the Bible is the Word of God. How would we determine what agreements matter and what agreements don't matter? And those are the kinds of questions they're asking.
Yeah, and there's so much of our society today that are built on these modern concepts, whether it's separation of church and state, whether it's like a pluralistic thing. Well, if we just understand everybody's ideas and processes and the importance of dialogue, all of these things are built. Not saying they don't have values or can't be seen in other areas, but oftentimes those all have their foundation in terms of modernism, because Western Europe, Central Western Europe had been coming out of terrible wars between in the Reformation time period and after that. And it's like, well, how do we move forward with this? And Descartes' proposal was very interesting. Basically, as Stephen said, he wasn't going to use God as the ultimate foundation. He wasn't going to use the Catholic Church or any Protestant church as the foundation or an arbiter or ground of his view. He was going to say, what if we strip everything away? If we strip away God and society and the magistrate and the civil authorities, what do we have? Well, I have myself. That's it. Ultimately, I think. And that's the only thing that I can really rely on. Now, this is not an endorsement of Descartes. It's not an endorsement of his thought. We're just talking about the historical development. And so Descartes' famous line, "I think, therefore I am," was seen as this revolutionary new foundation. Oh, So we don't have to take what the Catholic Church says as the ground, or God as the ground, or society as the ground. We can go all the way back down to my self-perception, I think. And so if I can recognize that I think, and therefore I exist, that is a starting point. That is my genesis of how I then can be able to reason and interact, not only toward myself, but towards other people, is this ultimate foundation of the individual. And modernism, even though many of its iterations, as Stephen was pointing out, is not individualistic necessarily, it's still built upon the individual as the ultimate like unit and arbiter of nature, reason, religion, etc. It goes down to the individual. Obviously, later on, postmodernism will critique certain aspects of modernism, but turn that to on steroids, which is why some people, this is advancing a little bit, but some people even debate if postmodernism is a thing or if it's just hyper modernity. It's like modernity taken out to its logical conclusion. But we'll get to that later. But ultimately, Descartes posits the individual, the self-recognition, self-actualization, so to speak, of the individual as the ultimate ground of philosophical inquiry, which philosophic inquiry has to do with reality and reason and our existence. So what do you think on all that, Stephen?
Yeah. And so, I think to put this into a modern context, the person who says, let's remove all presuppositions and let's argue from there, is inheriting what Descartes was trying. I mean, that's what Descartes said. Remove it. Remove everything. Start with nothing. And can I put anything on the board, as it were? Right. And so in his mind, or in his language, what he would say, what I can put on the board is that I have faults. Or to put it more precisely, I have doubts. And because I have doubts, then that means I have existence, right? Because I have a thought. So I remove everything that I doubt. Well, the doubt is still there. And that doubt is coming from somewhere. And that somewhere is me. And therefore, if I have a thought, then I do exist, right? And so he is laying the groundwork for generations of people to say, let's remove everything from the board and let's start with nothing.
Right. Sorry to interject on this. This is going to go back to some of our previous conversations about the ideas of separation and fragmentation, because it's like, oh, let's distill it down. Let's be reductionist, which that reductionist move is separating from its context, separating from an environment, separating from everything that led up to this point, and try to extract what we believe is the foundational essence that then we can use to construct something else that we want. And it is a fragmented form of arrival or separation, which, as we already discussed in past conversations, is going to produce a whole lot of problems. Sorry for the interjection on that.
Yeah, no. And so I think what we'll see is the main shift is to say we can't take anything as received. Nothing can be handed to you. So what the prevailing notion about knowledge is that you received knowledge in some way. You received knowledge, and this major shift is, all right, I can reject everything and start all over right here and work outward. And I believe that ultimately is a rejection that is going to lay the groundwork for all kinds of false philosophies, false notions down the road. So, to explain, when somebody says, let's set all our presuppositions to the side. Hang on one second. Sorry about that. My computer went blank for a second. When somebody says, let's set all our presuppositions to the side, my response is going to be, well, no, that's impossible. What would be better is for us to try to examine our presuppositions, right? To try to test them and think about them, because it's impossible. It's impossible to have a blank mind and then still have conversation. Because then even language itself involves presuppositions, involves knowledge that's already there. So it just becomes an impossible reduction. You can't reduce it down to this. And so when somebody says, you're assuming God to start this conversation, well, you're assuming not God to start this conversation, right? Both of those are assumptions.
Or an unidentified God that they don't want to admit. That
Right,
they
sure.
smuggle in. Yeah.
Sure. But they'll say not God, right? They'll say, let's assume there is no God. How does that even work, right? And so that's the problem, is that what Descartes is doing is engaging in a conversation that really is impossible to have, and he's pretending that it is possible. And
That's how he starts. To be
Yeah.
fair to Descartes, right?
Yes.
That's how he starts.
Yes, fair.
He will get to God later on, in terms of trying to ground something. But even in this point of what Stephen's talking about, there's a lot of critique that is fair against Descartes, and we shouldn't romanticize or idealize Descartes' departure here, because I think it is a departure. Even though maybe he brings it back to God in the end, there's still some really big problems. Presupposition, as Stephen is talking about, is one of them. Another one is that his own presupposition, which he smuggles in, is the idea that there's even something that is true, that self-perception is true, and that truth by its nature is not self-contradictory. Those are presuppositions he's working on. I'll explain that in a little more detail. We don't have time to go into the full critique on this, but just the idea that I think, therefore I am, that there is a consistency between being and thinking, and that thinking means that you are existing. Well, that is what most people regard as a true statement. But recognizing the truth of that presupposes something, one, being true, and then truth being consistent with itself. Because if we lived in a system where really we could not take any other presupposition other than our own thought in and of itself, we could not even arrive to the idea that our thoughts are real or true or accurate. And this is ultimately the problem that Descartes is going to discuss later in his philosophies, when he's like, okay, we've gotten to the point to where we've stripped back everything. I think, therefore I am, I exist, and I can have grounded foundations on that. Well, here's a problem. Even though I exist, I perceive things. And Descartes was very concerned, and people today, sadly, they will laugh at Descartes. I remember one of my philosophy teachers, in college, she openly ridiculed Descartes' struggle with perception, because Descartes could get to the idea of, well, I think and I am and I perceive, but there's a huge chasm between I think, I am, and I perceive to my thoughts are real and true, reflecting of the reality around me. And so Descartes was constantly worried about, well, maybe there's a demon that is influencing our perception, and that I have this coffee mug here, but really it's not a coffee mug. The demon has turned it into a rattlesnake and it's going to kill me. And people read Descartes today and they're like, oh, he's so ridiculous. But what he's actually really dealing with is a serious problem. Is even if you can strip everything away, you're still faced with this daunting issue of how do we make sure that our perception or our thoughts are actually even real or grounded? And his ultimate answer to that, Descartes' ultimate answer was, a good God would not allow us to have perceptions that were radically different from the reality around us. He would not allow the coffee cup to turn into a rattlesnake because my perception was inaccurate. And this is where the modern, present day philosophers and university professors, which are not philosophers, but they will scoff at Descartes and be like, oh, he's just running back to his blanket of God. He just needs the security of God. No, he wasn't running for security. Descartes was already brave enough to try to strip everything away. He just got to the point where he's like, there's no other answer. There's literally no other answer to ground reality in terms of our knowledge without God. Now, it would have been better if he'd started with that, but he got to that. But there was serious damage done because his first move, as Stephen's pointed out, of stripping everything away sounds great. People want that, but then they'll stop there with this self-actualized and realized individual, and not go the honest way to its end of what Descartes did and say, we have to have God to ground it. And so the movement of Descartes, that Cartesian, as it's called, the Cartesian shift, prompted an avalanche. But to be fair to Descartes, he went the whole way with the argument, whereas a lot of people don't. They just stop and say, well, we can remove all presuppositions and get down to a radical individual as the basis of all things. But that's not where Descartes stopped, to be fair.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think that's part of the problem with all of this as we're looking through is that people read philosophers, and I mean, you and I were talking earlier about novels. People read philosophers' novels, whatever, and they take the part that they latch on to a certain point. People do this with scriptures, right? I mean, they get halfway through an argument and they don't follow it to its conclusion, and then they say, "I got the part I want," right? And so, yeah, I'm not here to condemn the life and the thinking of Descartes. I'm simply what we do want to do is recognize that he put this thought out on the table. Now he went on and got to God. I think sometimes, I will say this, I think he got to God in ways that in the end maybe didn't answer all the questions. He opened some doors and didn't shut them all, if you will.
That's fair. Mm-hmm.
But bottom line is Descartes, first of all, he was not seeking a way to deny God.
That's right.
He was actually seeking a way to reconcile God for the skeptics who had come out of this sort of post-Reformation fatigue of the interfighting and so forth, and saying, if this is the result of us all reading the Bible, then is there really a God, right? So there's that sort of skepticism coming out, and Descartes wants to address that, but he wants to address it as somebody who says, yes, there is, but I'm not sure I can prove it to you from the Bible, or at least he is talking to people who've already rejected the Bible as a foundation, because obviously it's just produced all of this fracturing. So he's like, okay, is there another way that I can show you that there's a God? And I do think still a lot of our apologetics is kind of rooted in that same mindset that says, I'm going to go meet the atheist on his turf.
Yep.
The skeptic on his turf. Yeah, but then what you're saying is, I'm going to participate with his presuppositions and then try to argue, having already accepted his presuppositions, I'm going to try to argue him out of it. I think that would be my critique, not of where Descartes arrives, but in the opening thought processes. I think he's already given away too much. And regardless of whether he maybe repairs that in his own mind, that's what people take from Descartes, right? Even if he does better down the road, the fundamental philosophy that they take is an erroneous one, and so
that's also evident with Descartes' contemporary Blaise Pascal, which he's kind of grabbed, like, it shifted a whole thing of saying, we can't take for granted God's existence. We need to be able to prove it through these new scientific means, because science is developing in the Renaissance, and various philosophies of science are shifting, and they're starting to say, okay, well, we should be able to utilize these new perspectives of philosophy and science to prove God, instead of realizing, no, God's the basis of that. You don't use something that's derivative of God to then wipe God off the face and say, well, now we're going to use these other tools. And that created this big shift. And as Stephen said, what ended up happening from like the fallout of Descartes is that people just took part of Descartes. And this is something that's noteworthy in terms of the history of philosophy. Philosophers interact with each other. They will talk with each other in a way, if they're contemporary. But even if they're like not living at the same time, you'll have guys philosophers who are talking to previous generations, or even some who go all the way back and still struggle with Plato and Aristotle and are in conversation, they'll say, with those guys, not like physically talking with them, but grappling with their ideas. And most of the time, the guys who come afterwards, they are very selective about which parts they want to talk about with the previous philosophers. So what happens today, same, people like Descartes, they'll say, I'll take this piece and this piece, and then all the other pieces they'll not think about. So imagine taking parts of a puzzle piece that someone had created a puzzle, and you're like, I want to take these 5 pieces of the puzzle. And then you add your own pieces that you create. And then someone after that says, well, Caleb's arguments are interesting. I'll take some of Caleb's arguments. Well, he'd be robbing not just Caleb, he'd also be robbing from or conversing with Descartes. And so there's a line that happens here. And so there's a way that there's an evolution, so to speak, of the thought process that doesn't always capture that person. So we talk about Descartes now, and it's not always capturing Descartes' full argument or his context. And those farther down the line, they are pulling things from him and building on Descartes' foundation, but not taking the entirety of it and then adding their stuff. So it becomes a moving target, so to speak. But the foundation of the individual is something that had a lot of utilitarian effect for not having to submit to the Bible, revelation, God, the limitations of that worldview, so they could rip out that part of Descartes, build on their own, and start creating other systems. And that's kind of how modernity as a whole started moving.
So let me throw in another element here. So the first time I ever heard Descartes' name was in math class. So he was a mathematician as well as a philosopher, and there was a lot of overlap between mathematics and philosophy. And of course, this goes back to Pythagoras, even in Greek times. There's a lot of philosophy there. And so one additional element here is people were departing and saying the Bible lacks precision, and so it makes it hard for us to agree on it. Where can we find precision? And math was one of those places, and people began to think of math as something that would open up the mysteries of life to us with precision. Like we could test things and see things, and mathematics would sort of explain things about the world to us, really at a spiritual level, right? More than just the material level, but at a spiritual level. There was this view of math would reveal ultimate truth, not just sort of at the pragmatic level. And so there's some assumptions being put in place there. But what also is happening is you're having a separation of what is knowable, right? So what is knowable is what we can perceive with precision, what we can calculate, what we can put in a test tube, versus this not knowable with any precision, which is where the Bible falls into that category. At least much of the Bible falls into this category of just that's not really, that falls into a values and personal opinion ultimately. And so we see this today with the fact value distinction. When we're talking about political things, we put that into no matter the nature, no matter how rooted that political discussion may be in realities and moral questions, we still say ultimately that's an opinion. Mm-hmm. But this over here, this is science, and science isn't a matter of opinion. And so we make that distinction. Well, Descartes, Pascal, and several others of that era began to lay the groundwork. I'm not saying they even meant to, but they began to lay the groundwork for that fact value distinction.
Sure. Yeah, and we'll see more of that fact value distinction hopefully in a bit when we talk about rationalism and empiricism, the two main branches of epistemology, the study of thought. But something real quick on what Stephen said about the rise of science, particularly, and the rise of scientific inquiry and philosophy undergirds the modernistic movement. They're very much married together. And one of the things that I think we have to think about is in terms of knowledge or epistemology, not just where knowledge comes from, but what can we do with the knowledge and what utility or benefit it has to me. And this is where science is, science just means knowledge. And this is where it's very powerful, because the scientific materialistic inquiry says, look, we can make your life better by reducing things, putting things together, synthesizing, and creating things that are of benefit to you. We can have predictive power over the elements, over the way elements combine, or the weather, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's this power element to science, and there's a predictive element to science. These are things that they looked at and say, well, the Bible can't do this. Now, many of those early modern philosophers were very religious. I mean, even guys like Isaac Newton, he wrote more religious treatises than he did on physics and other science. And even chemistry back in those days was still in the form of alchemy. So I'm not trying to say that there was this full out religious rejection, but science as this tool that could be used was something that people would then compare to religion and say, well, okay, what can religion do? Religion can't predict the weather. Religion can't, help me get over my flu or my sickness. It can't make our system better, is because they were looking at what they would argue material realities. And this goes back to the fact value split that we see later on. But I also think it still has a lot of power today, and we are still in the system. The simple proof of this is how people looked at the pandemic. When people looked at the pandemic, it was trust the science. Because why? The science can predict. The science can tell us. The science will guide us to have the best possible outcome. Well, what about values? What about human interaction? What about honesty? What about all these things? Nope, doesn't matter. That's not a part of the science. And so people really started looking at that idea of science as being true or the ultimate reality, even though they may have not framed it in that. And that's not something new. That view of what took place in the pandemic is like 400 years in the making, right? I mean, that started back in the time of Pascal and Descartes, and that's what they were grappling. So we got to be careful not to condemn them, or think, oh, they were silly for going back to God or whatever, because the pandemic and our current philosophical and religious state shows that we haven't really advanced much, despite as Stephen said, the myth of progress. We haven't really advanced much beyond Descartes' struggles in a lot of ways. So,
yeah, and the thought process. I mean, again, to give credit, I mean some credit. The thought process was that through this science, we would know God better.
Yeah,
we would know Him even better than reading our Bibles. And I think that's where the danger happened. I think we do know God better through science, but we don't know Him better than the Bible. I think we bring it alongside, and the problem comes when there's a competition and a rejection and says, look, this is just not getting us there, right? We can't know Him precisely. So let's go here and we'll have a more precise knowledge of God. We'll know Him better.
Because there's a hierarchical priority that comes if sometimes people talk about it as like natural revelation versus specific revelation, or inspired revelation. And so if there is this sense of, well, natural revelation can get us to God, which I agree, that was, especially in the early moderns, they had that idea of, well, we can know God better through His creation. But what ended up happening was an exaltation that Scripture ultimately became the handmaiden to science. And if there was anything that was even perceived to be contradictory, it was not, well, we have confidence in revelation. We're going the specific inspired revelation or written revelation. We're going to use that to interpret or frame our perception, and that will be part of our foundational presupposition of analyzing this other thing. It was, no, we've stripped all this. We know this is actually true. Why? Because we stripped off the presuppositions of inspiration, written revelation, etc. And this is real knowledge. I can't tell you how many young Christians, even today, I've talked to, and they talk about scientific things as being like in a vacuum, that they don't have presuppositions, that this is the real knowledge of things. And this is where the idea of like the brain in the jar comes from. When people talk critically, as I do many times, about modernism, they'll talk about, oh, well, that's just a brain in a jar concept. And what we mean by that is there is a perception that is not influenced by anything. You can isolate human rationality. You can isolate human perception, put it in this jar, and then it will be true because you've abstracted it from everything. It's the pure essence of reality of human perception. Well, that's not real. That doesn't exist. And this is ultimately the problem that a lot of the modernist philosophers are going to have. And this is the vengeance of postmodernism that's going to come back and say, no, this pure rationalism, this pure scientism is not real. Like, it's a myth that you guys created. And that's where we struggle back and forth in our society of this pull of modernity and post-modernity, because it's like, well, is science real? Is our perception real? How much of that is accurate versus not? How much are we embodied versus not? And this really, I think, sets us up to a discussion of rationalism versus empiricism. We're not going to get into a ton of this because both rationalism and empiricism are two sides of the modernist movement. You could still be a rationalist and be a modernist, or an empiricist and be a modernist. But rationalists like Descartes and others, they thought that things could be known a priori, that is through pure reason. So when you think about rationalism as a system, it's going to be like pure mathematics, theoretical physics and theoretical mathematics. Like, we can work out the arguments and the projections through reason alone. Whereas the empiricist side says, no, reason alone is not a thing. We don't just receive structures of knowledge. Everything that we know is learned through an engagement, through a tactile reality and experience. So it's very much, empiricism is observational, experiential knowledge. This is the a posteriori view of knowledge. And so that debate goes all the way back to Plato, who was more of a rationalist, versus Aristotle, who's more of an empiricist, and it's present in terms of that form of knowledge as well within the modernist movement. But once again, being a rationalist, thinking a priori, structural knowledge of reason, did not cease to make you modernist, just like being an empiricist. There was an underlying argument that provided more on that. Sorry, I transitioned us to rationalism versus empiricism, Stephen, but what are you thinking on that?
Well, and we'll come to that more fully as we go along. But again, the groundwork was laid for some other, separations that you just sort of mentioned there, that brain in a jar. Again, Descartes laid the groundwork for a dividing of the mental and the physical, the spiritual and the physical. Yeah. And people began to view our bodies, for instance, as mechanistic, and began to talk about our bodies in terms of machines, right? We still do that. We say our brains are like computers. And it's not that there's no similarity there, but I think in some quarters, not just some quarters, in many quarters, people really think that what computers are doing is the same thing that our minds are doing, right? And so, that's AI, right? That's what people think, is that they are making a machine capable of what the human mind does. But the human mind is not doing something merely physical
or computational. That's what they think it is.
Yes, that it's just a matter of processing data. But that's not all that our minds are doing. Whereas that is all that a computer is capable of doing, is processing data. And so we are still operating under these assumptions. In fact, not just still operating, we've taken them way farther than the initial assumptions or the initial language that sort of laid the groundwork. That was sort of where you're making these distinctions, and then people really do treat their bodies in ways that it's just a machine, right? Yeah. And there's not a connectivity between this created body that the breath of life has been breathed into, with a soul, an embodied soul. Yeah. And then minimize, therefore, the importance of the physical in many ways.
Yeah, I've said in the past that modernism, and there's two different types of modernism here, but modernism is a form of like neo-Gnosticism. If you think about Gnosticism in the first century, of what the early church had, first century and onward, had to battle with, it was this separation of the material from the spirit. And they said, well, the spirit's the real thing, right? That's what it is. And they were taking kind of Platonic thought of the forms and then denying the physical reality, to the point where they would deny the incarnation of Jesus, deny the bodily resurrection of Christ, and say, oh, what we even do in the physical body doesn't count as sin. A lot of terrible things. Well, this was kind of like the same thing in a lot of ways, where people would say then, well, the physical is really all that matters. That's the real science of it. And then, or they would deny any of the heaven. So if you think about this as like a relationship of heaven and earth, and that's what Genesis portrays us at. God, we are the stuff of heaven, so to speak. It's almost not sacrilegious, but God breathed into us the breath of life. The stuff of heaven mixed with the clay and the dirt of the ground. So we are a combination, and the incarnation of Christ is ultimately the fulfillment of this, of God taking flesh, and the two brought together. And the incarnational model is really the only model that makes any sense. But what happens with Gnosticism early on, they denied the material, they denied earth and wanted heaven. Well, what happens in the more neo-Gnosticism of the modernity is they deny heaven and they just focus on earth. Well, what happens when you deny heaven? Well, you're not made in the image of God. There's no dignity to it. It's just a mechanistic thing, like ants, or walking across the ground. It doesn't matter, like if you squish one or whatever. And this is where many of the terrible things that come from all the wars, the abuses that happened in the 18th, or you could include the 18th, but especially the 19th and 20th centuries, are in the slavery, that the particular brands of slavery that arose. I know slavery wasn't unique to only the 19th and 20th, but the particular manifestations of them. All of that is really built on that separation of the inverted Gnosticism of the material at the denial of the spirit. And how did we get here? Exactly as Stephen said, through Descartes, the Cartesian move of ripping out context, ripping out an integrated or an incarnated model, and begin to first isolate the reason. And if you isolate reason, people come back and critique that rationalist view and say, well, that doesn't make sense. How do we incorporate all the other things? And then there's the pushback on the empiricists. And then the removal of anything that is spirit down to the mechanistic thing, to where the point where even friends of mine today that are very modernistic, they will say, well, there's really no such thing as love. There's really no such thing as liberty. There's really no such thing as any of this. It's just a bunch of atoms moving around in your mind. And whether we're talking about mental health, whether we're talking about the dignity of human life, or the question of whether fetuses, babies in the womb are human or not, all of these things they want to treat as just these materialistic forms. And how does that come? It comes all the way back from Descartes, believe it or not.
Yeah. So, to put this in, C.R. Wiley talks about this in his book, The Household and the War for the Cosmos. He talks about Carl Sagan pointing to the stars and saying we are made, we share matter, right? So we're made of the stuff of stars.
Yeah.
And what he's trying to do is lift our sense of self all the way to the stars.
He was a romantic secularist, or a materialist, a romantic materialist.
Yeah. Well, okay, that's great. So, but that's as high as he can go. Yeah. And then, the Wiley makes the point, and I think it's a beautiful point. We're not just made of the stuff of stars. We're made of the stuff of the one who made the stars.
Yep.
And that changes everything, right? And if you take that assumption away and the stars are as high as you can go, then they're still just rocks at the end of the day. And that is not a transcendent thought. That doesn't help you see it doesn't give value or importance or meaning. And you end up in a dark place.
And on that real quick, in terms of maybe a critique or pushback here, we haven't focused on explaining all the critique against the modernistic move here, or the Cartesian move. But if you take away God from it, all you end up is what we call humanism. Humanism is the center that the human, and especially the individualistic humanism is a particular type of humanism that says the measure of all things is man. You might have heard that. Man is the measure of all. Or man is, and ultimately saying we ourselves are the center of the universe. We are, and they may argue, well, not the material universe, but ultimately our reason, our understanding, we define and determine truth, whether collectively or individually, depending on your particular style of it. And the removal of God on that and the exaltation of the individual and of the human to replace God has no grounding at all. It flattens everything. And that's where you see, as Stephen was pointing out, this impulse of a guy like Carl Sagan to be like, no, guys, we're really made of stuff of the stars. We gotta go up, because he recognizes you flatten it down to earth and you just trample and trample and trample. It creates nihilism. Really, if there's nothing more than you or me and that's it, and we're not made of the stuff of God, there's no human dignity whatsoever, then this has a terrible impact on moral philosophy, right? Where it's like, I can take from you, I can rape, kill, murder, abuse, whatever, so long as it benefits me. Because take God out of the picture, and then there's no ground. There's no judge. There's no standard. There's nothing. And I would even go a step farther, specifically focusing on epistemology. There's no way to know if we are not made from the essence of God, if our spirit, our rational self is not from God, then where does it come from? Evolution? Let's just concede it comes from evolution for a second. Okay? Well, then how do we know that we evolutionarily evolved to be reflective of truth and not just have a particular advantage of our environment? We understand that other animals can't see color the way that we do. Well, what if a dog were to have a conversation with a human and say, well, you guys perceive color wrong. Well, we don't perceive it this way. Well, okay, who's right, the dog or the human? The evolutionists can just say, well, the dog doesn't see color the way the humans do because he was evolutionarily conditioned to have that perception. Okay, now do the human. Are our perceptions just evolutionarily conditioned to provide a particular benefit for us that's not actually reflective of reality? If they say yes, they've lost all epistemological grounds. Yeah. They cannot say that any of their scientific observations, any of their perceptions, any of their thought processes are actually true. They're nihilist. They don't believe in anything. And that's what ultimately goes. And so you can appreciate a guy like Carl Sagan, who is like, oh, we can't go there. But he has no ground to try to lift people to the stars, because he gets to the same point. He can't even know if we're made of the stuff of the stars, like he asserts, if there is no God. And this is the ridiculousness of it, and which is why I was telling Stephen, is that I love talking about epistemology with people. I know it can be very heady. I know it can be very abstract and sometimes maddening. But without God, you cannot know anything. Yeah. So the atheist who proudly proclaims, oh, there's no God, he has no epistemological ground to do so. The best he can say is, I am evolutionarily conditioned to not believe in God and say that he does not exist, but that there's no actual certainty of any of his claims, whether that's God or science or anything. So God ultimately was not just the conclusion of Descartes and other guys like Pascal and Berkeley. It's really the only answer for anything with epistemology.
Yeah, but and so I think one thing to take away, and we're getting down the road a lot. I mean, and we have to, but we're pointing to where this leads.
Yeah.
And Descartes did not say there is no God. He said quite the opposite. Mm-hmm. But in the way that he talked about God and the things that he conceded in the conversation about God, he laid groundwork that other men would try to stand on to say there is no God. That's right. And that's the point, is he gave philosophical philosophical grounding for people to say, based on this, right? If this is true, if I think therefore I am is true, and that's the basis of thought, then rationalism and so forth is gonna spring from that. I would just I think other guys like Pascal, the famous Pascal's wager. I think it's such a good example of somebody trying to help people with doubts and trying to bring them near to God. But they're massive holes in the way that he goes about that. So Pascal's wager is ultimately, if you behave as if there is a God, and it turns out that there is, then you'll have one eternity. If you behave that there's a God, and it turns out that there's not a God, you will have lost very little. And so, hedge your bets, right? Put the weight on what
it's a cost risk analysis.
Yeah, cost risk analysis. Pascal's wager falls flat on its face in the book of Job, because the whole point of the book of Job is, will a man serve God for nothing? And Pascal's wager says, serving God, you don't lose anything by serving God. Job, the book of Job says you might lose everything by serving God, and then you should still serve God. And so these it doesn't deal with the complexities of life, right? So
how did Pascal, to give Pascal's due, just like we did with Descartes, right? He arrived there because he was not thinking about the connection of this to reality, as you're pointing out with Job. What he's thinking is, I cannot prove 100% through rationalistic, through scientific means that God exists. So what am I going to do if I can't have absolute epistemological proof? Because he's already stripped away the presuppositions like Descartes did, right? He's arrived at this point. It's like, well, what do I have to do? I have to act. I have to do something. I can't just not live. And so this is where Pascal's argument comes. And I think that there is something where I agree with the critique that you mentioned on Pascal. But I've got a soft spot for Pascal, because he comes back later on and he's like, people will say that he'll say, you fake it till you make it. That you go through the act of believing in God, you go through the act of church and serving, and ultimately you kind of arrive at belief. So Soren Kierkegaard later picks up the mantle of Pascal in a lot of ways and presents much better arguments, in my opinion, than Pascal. But this idea of what I've called praxis, of kind of reading Pascal and saying, well, he's actually arguing for praxis of like doing, a knowledge through doing. I don't think Pascal knew it, but I think he was actually arguing against this like disembodied rationalism. I don't think he had it all there. And I'm not saying I do, and I'm not trying to say I'm better than Pascal, but I think he recognized that there was something about the act of doing that brought you to a knowledge. And so I'm with you. I reject the Pascalian wager through rationalistic means, but if you look at it through a means of practice and say, if you have to act, you have to do, what is the better way of doing? I understand your critique on Job that, it doesn't reflect reality. But I think that's where Pascal was kind of between a rock and a hard place, because he was trying to take that Cartesian move and the scientific separation and say, how can I operate in their camp or like on their debating grounds of supposition and still live as a human, engage and operate with some actual direction. And so I'm not saying he was right. I think Pascal's error is exactly as you pointed out. He bought into the idea, like, let's strip away the presuppositions. But my soft spot for Pascal is that I think his idea of active praxis is like an attempt to get back to that integrated form. I'm not trying to justify Pascal. Sorry.
Yeah. So let me say this moving forward, and we'll close out here. With all of these guys, I quote Pascal, very fondly in a number of different ways. I think he's very helpful, and Descartes as well.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we're going to be dealing with all through this is that part of the difficulty is the swinging pendulum, is overreactions. And so as we're going through these philosophies, one of the problems I see is that people are reacting, and I know, Caleb and I agree on this, is that people are reacting to postmodernism by trying to defeat it with modernist assumptions, right? Just retreat back to modernism. And that's a faulty, but the reality is that there are true assumptions within modernism. There's true things that Descartes was getting at. He was mingling it with some false assumptions. The same thing is happening with Pascal, right? There's a way in which his wager, you can see, like Proverbs presents that picture, right? Of this will just be good for life, right? And so, but then there's a way that it fails to answer ultimate questions. Yeah. And so what we want to do is rightly divide, is say, okay, yeah, you got this right, but we can't throw all in with Pascal or Descartes. And we need to recognize not only, and the reason we need to even interact with these guys, because somebody might say, well, if they get things wrong, then just throw them all in the trash can and start over and just read your Bible. But the thing is, we live and breathe in the world that they've influenced.
Yep.
And we have been raised with those thought processes. And a lot of times we've been raised, people say, what we need is common sense. Where does that common come from? Right. And so we're operating within the common knowledge that's been handed down to us. And that's what we're trying to do, is the very thing I said earlier, is examine our presuppositions. Right. What are the things we assume when we enter into conversations? And so I think some of the things we assume, a lot of the things we assume are sort of these thoughts distilled down through the ages and still held on to today. And we want to see, where do we need to strip away and say, okay, even though we've had this for about 400 years, it's time to remove that assumption because it wasn't a good one from the start.
Yep. It's like doing a remodel job on a house. You get down and you're like, oh, the foundation's messed up. You don't keep trying to change the door jambs or the shutters or the shingles. Like, you got to get down and fix that foundation, or you're always going to have problems. And that foundational aspect of the Cartesian and modernist movement, I know in this conversation we haven't really dealt with all the epistemology of all the modernists, right? But it's kind of like early modern, stretching all the way through. But that early modern time with epistemology, those discussions influence even today. And I would say that in my lifetime, I've met very few, very, very, very few brethren who have not taken a Cartesian Descartes assumptions, whether it's in their apologetics, whether it's in their worldview. This is the water they swim in, it's the air they breathe. It is very, very few brethren that I have known that have tackled those assumptions and said, I'm going to go a different way. And so I think Stephen's point's absolutely right. If you're thinking, well, Descartes was in the 1600s, like, what does he to do with me? It's like, well, no, you're still in his system. If you're living in the West, you're dealing with Cartesian logic, 100%, or the effects of Cartesian logic. But one of the things on epistemology we talk about, like how we know, what is the basis of knowing, what is the basis of our even reasoning. This has a profound impact also on cosmology, as we've said, and ontology. I already kind of mentioned and hinted at that. It's like, if humans are the measure of all things, there is no God. That says something about who we are. It says something about our nature. It says something about the system that we live in. We talked about with Carl Sagan, right? His cosmology, right, and ontology is that humans are just the products of stardust that have evolved over billions and billions of years. And that says something about the ontology, and it says something about the way that the system he wouldn't even view as created, just happened. And so, and teleology is present in there also with cosmology. So we talked about epistemology, but that's not to say that cosmology and ontology aren't right there with it, because it's a package deal, really. And yes, certain guys like Descartes might have a certain type of epistemology that is different from like a David Hume, who is more of an empiricist, but they're still operating in the same ballpark. That's like saying, well, this guy plays first base and the other guy plays third base. They're still playing baseball. And that's what we're dealing with this Cartesian move to modernity. You might have different positions here and there, but they're still under that umbrella system of humanism. And that changes knowledge, the structure of the cosmos, and their definitions of being.
Yeah. All right. So we'll pick up here and kind of carry that forward a little bit, talk about some of the consequences, some of the building blocks that were put on top of this, and continue on this discussion next time. Thanks, Caleb.
Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate your work. God bless.
Likewise.